Welcome to the Retirement Made Easy podcast. I'm your host, Greg Gonzalez. My goal for the podcast is to help you live a better life in retirement by giving you the tools and information you need in a language that you can understand. On this week's episode, I wanted to talk about the worst retirement plan that I have ever encountered in my career. I met this individual, and we'll keep this person's name anonymous, about 8 years ago. They were a listener from my radio show in St. Louis, and they were looking for a second opinion on their retirement. There's a famous quote that says, "A smart man learns from his own mistakes, but a wise man learns from the mistakes of others." Hopefully on today's episode, you can learn about these mistakes and how to avoid them for your own retirement. Before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to remind listeners to check out our website, which is retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. That's retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. While you're there, check out my free retirement secret sauce, as well as our 2020 tax planning guide. Both free resources you can check out, as well as listen to previous episodes. So check out our website, retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. While you're there, you can ask a question for the show, and I always get back with listeners within 48 hours or so. So love to hear your questions as well. All right, today's episode, I am going to detail the worst retirement plan I have ever seen in my career. This occurred, as I mentioned, about 8 years ago, and I remember this meeting and this individual distinctly. I mean, it's all I could think of for the next 2 weeks after the meeting occurred. And what I'll do today is detail these mistakes. A lot of them are very obvious to you, and they're going to jump out like, why would this person do this? Unfortunately for this individual, many of these choices and decisions that were made ended up being permanent, meaning this individual could not change the decision or change their choice at any point in the future. So once you make certain decisions in retirement, there's no going back. You have to live with those decisions for the rest of your life. That's why it's so important, so crucial to make sure that you understand the choices you're making ahead of time and how it's going to impact your life and your spouse's life for the next 30 or even 40 years. So let's talk about this individual and their situation in retirement. So the story goes like this. The guy's name, and I'll call him George. George was 72 years old. He had been retired for a number of years, and his wife was 8 years younger than George. So George was 72, his wife was 64. His wife didn't come to the meeting, which I found that odd, and I asked him about it. And this is the big mistake number one when it came to George's retirement plan. I asked him, I said, "Oh, well, George, your wife is not here with us today." And he said, "My wife doesn't need to know anything about the retirement. She trusts me 100%. She's not interested in this retirement planning. It's not her thing. And I don't think it's important that she be here, so I just left her at home." And so for me personally, when I see one spouse kind of take the wheel and leave the other spouse in the dark, this is a huge, huge mistake. Because what if something happens to George? His wife's going to be up a creek. Even if George's wife doesn't have a financial background, she kind of needs to know the ins and outs of what's going on and what she needs to do if George is unable to make those decisions. You kind of have to make sure she understands the highlights of the retirement plan so she's comfortable. But to just leave her in the dark, I think that's a recipe for failure. But that's my personal opinion. But my advice to everyone out there is to plan your retirement with your spouse, not without your spouse. If we look at George's situation, George is 72 years old when I met him. His wife was 8 years younger. She's 64. Statistically, at some point, George's wife is 8 years younger, statistically, outlived George. So to not include her in these decisions, I think is a terrible idea. And as we go further and further into George's situation, George and his spouse's retirement situation, you'll understand why George was not only leaving his wife in the dark, but not really planning for their joint retirement. Well, he may have thought he was, but really he wasn't. Mistake number 2 that George made, and this was a biggie, was when it came to his pension plan. George was retired for a number of years, and when I met him, he was 72 and collecting a monthly pension. And I always ask people collecting a monthly pension, what choice did you make when you chose that pension? Was it 100% survivorship, meaning if George passes away, his wife gets the same monthly amount? Is it 50% survivorship, meaning if George were to pass away, his wife would get half of that amount for the rest of his life? What was it? And he said he took the single life annuity option, which means George receives $2,500 a month for the rest of his life, and upon his death, the pension essentially stops and there's nothing paid out to his spouse at that point. And I thought to myself, okay, George is 72, his wife is 8 years younger, she's 64, and he's going to sit here and tell me that he chose the single life annuity option. So that's a big risk for his wife. If he were to predecease her, which statistically that's going to happen because he's got an 8-year head start on her, being 8 years older, and women live statistically 4 to 5 years longer than men do. So a huge risk to his retirement plan, or I should say George and his wife's retirement plan, because we're planning for a couple, for a joint retirement. There's a huge risk that if something happens to George and George passes away, that pension is going to be gone. That $2,500 a month essentially evaporates and is not going to be there for his wife. So I asked George, I said, okay, well, this is the single life, $2,500 a month. Let's say something were to happen to you. Do you have any life insurance? And George right away said, no, I got no life insurance. I did not appreciate hearing that at all. Normally, the people that take the single life annuity option have a life insurance policy where if they pass away, the life insurance maybe is there for their spouse. George did not have that in place. So a huge risk to their plan is what happens when George passes away. So the lesson here is be extremely careful when selecting your pension choices and ask yourself, what's going to happen if the older spouse passes away? What's going to happen if the younger spouse passes away? Run through those scenarios because you want to make sure that your spouse is going to be okay should something terrible happen to you. And George, I don't think, really thought this through. He saw that the single life annuity was the highest monthly pension value, and that was attractive to him. Mistake number 3. And this applied to Social Security elections. This might not surprise you. It didn't surprise me when George told me that he claimed his benefit right away at age 62. He also told me that his wife claimed her benefit per his suggestion to claim her benefit right away at 62. So they claim the lowest benefit possible in order to get the Social Security right away. In my opinion, for a lot of people, when there's a big age gap between spouses, you want to make sure that the younger spouse is going to be taken care of. And how Social Security works is there's what's called a survivor benefit. So what many people try to do is to maximize the survivor benefit. So in George's case, he had the higher benefit. So by delaying his benefit longer, should something happen to him, his wife is going to have a higher survivor benefit for the rest of her life. So by taking his benefit right away at 62, he greatly reduced the survivor benefit that would be there for his wife. A lot of times what people try to plan for, is to maximize the higher of the two benefits. And George's was that higher of the two benefits, but he didn't plan properly, and instead he claimed his benefit right away at 62. Big mistake in my book. So George here had no life insurance. He claimed his Social Security benefit right away, and he took the single life annuity with his pension. And I was sitting here thinking, could this story get any worse? And that's when George said, yeah, but there's some reasoning behind the decisions that I made. And this is mistake number 4. He said, you don't understand the family that my wife came from. They're wealthy, or they were in the past, so she is set to, at some point, get an inheritance from her mother. Her mother is 92 years old and is still as healthy as a horse, but at some point, my wife's probably going to get a nice inheritance and she'll be just fine. This is a huge mistake. Have you ever heard the saying, don't count your chickens before they hatch? The same thing goes with an inheritance. You cannot count on an inheritance to make your plan successful. I'll say that again. Please do not count on a future inheritance to make your plan successful. In other words, an inheritance to save you. And that's what George's plan was all along, was that, oh, my wife's going to inherit this money at some point, so we can live for today and not for tomorrow. So whenever she gets the inheritance, she's going to be really, really well off, and we can enjoy that inheritance money. There are so many things that can happen with estates and estate planning. To count on an inheritance before you receive it is just very, very foolish. I can provide countless examples of people who thought they were going to get a big inheritance, and when it was all said and done, they got very, very little. Let's think about George's wife's mother. George's mother-in-law is 92 years old. What if she needed long-term care? My grandfather's long-term care, and this was just a few years ago that he passed away, it was $8,600 a month, and that did not include medication. So if George's mother-in-law needed long-term care, $8,600 a month, that adds up very, very quickly. Let's say she needed this long-term care. She developed dementia or Alzheimer's and needed this care for 4 to 5 years. That's a lot of money. That can greatly reduce any inheritance that George's wife was expecting. Let's consider another possibility. What if George's mother-in-law changed her wishes? What if later on in life she decided that she wanted to give all of her wealth to charity, and George's wife received no inheritance? That is an entirely possible situation. And as I got further into my discussion with George, it seemed like both he and his wife were both counting on an inheritance from his mother-in-law at some point in the future. And that leads me to mistake number 4. Mistake number 4, George did not have long-term care insurance. His wife did not have long-term care insurance, and neither of them had life insurance either. And George stated that the reasoning behind that was whenever they get this inheritance, they wouldn't need it. But what George didn't think about was his mother-in-law is 92 years old and George is 72. What if George predeceases his mother-in-law, his pension stops? What kind of shape is George's wife going to be in? Or what if George at 72 or 73 years old needed long-term care and it cost $8,600 a month like it cost my grandfather just a few years ago? That leads me to mistake number 5. As I looked at George's retirement statements and retirement savings, and I looked at how much he was spending every month, both he and his wife, they said they were spending about $10,000 or $11,000 a month. $2,500 of that came from George's pension. They had very small Social Security benefits because they both claimed at age 62, and the rest came from their retirement savings. And when I looked at the values of their retirement savings, and I looked at how much they were withdrawing every month, I determined that George was withdrawing north of 9% per year from their retirement accounts. And I told George that conventional wisdom says that the rule of thumb of 4% to 5%, meaning for a typical retired couple out there, it's recommended that they withdraw 4 to 5% of their account balance in retirement to live on. It's the 4% rule. Maybe Google 4% rule. A lot of you out there are familiar with that. So if the experts tell us that the accepted withdrawal rate from our retirement savings is 4 to 5%, and George is withdrawing over 9% per year, that's a huge, huge risk for George and his wife of running out of money at some point in the future. And George said, well, I like to golf. I have memberships at 3 different country clubs. That's where most of this money goes. And I know I'm probably withdrawing too much, but we're going to have this inheritance at some point and we'll be just fine. So George was overspending in retirement. He should have been only spending 4 to 5% of his retirement accounts, but he was spending north of 9% which is probably about double what he should be spending, what he could afford to spend. And I asked George, are you at all concerned about at some point running out of money? And he said, I'll never forget it. He said, well, this money will probably last as long as I'm on this earth, but my wife is going to be fine. It's probably going to be gone for my wife, but she'll get the inheritance and she'll be just fine, and I'll be long gone by then. It's funny, the story that he had for the future that he had played out in his head. He knew how the script would read, and unfortunately, that's not how life works. None of us have an expiration date on our birth certificate. If we did, it would be a lot easier to plan. Now, I realize for many men out there, and even women, golf may be a lot of fun, but it's not worth jeopardizing your future. And not just your future, but your wife's future as well. A word of caution to all listeners out there, don't overspend in retirement, because once your money is gone, it's gone. If you're spending 9% or 10% of your retirement savings every year, there is a high likelihood of running out of money in retirement. And especially in George's situation, not for his own retirement, because he was only 72, but his wife was 64, 8 years younger. Trust me when I say this, you never want to have to go to your spouse and inform him or her that, hey, the money's all gone. And lastly, I wanted to talk about mistake number 6. This is the biggest and best that I saved for last, and it's the simplest. As I was looking at George's retirement statements, I asked George, I said, I thought you said your wife's name was, and I'll make something up, Nancy. And George said, yes, her name is Nancy. And I asked George, I said, well, how come I see someone else's name listed as your 100% primary beneficiary on all these statements? I said, when I'm looking at all these statements, I see the name Linda and then followed by your last name. And he said, oh, that's my ex-wife. And then I asked him, well, how long have you been married to Nancy? And he said, well, about 14 or 15 years. And it was at that point that I sat back in my chair and I thought to myself, okay, George took the single life pension option. So if something happened to him, there would be no pension benefit for his wife. He also took Social Security at age 62. So if something happened to him, his wife Nancy would have the smallest possible survivor benefit for the rest of her life. He has no life insurance. He has no long-term care insurance. So if something happened to him, those resources would not be there. And now we're finding out 95% of his net worth is in these retirement accounts, which if something happened to him, he didn't have his wife Nancy as the primary beneficiary. He had his ex-wife Linda as the primary beneficiary. So if something happened to him, all of the retirement accounts would go to his ex-wife Linda and not his wife Nancy. And it was at that point that he said, yeah, I should probably get that changed right away, shouldn't I? And I said, yes, I would call right now, in fact. Imagine if Nancy would have been there in that meeting when we discovered that his ex-wife Linda was named as the 100% beneficiary of their entire retirement savings. I bet she would have slapped him over the head. Thank goodness nothing had happened to him up until that point. Looking back on all these mistakes that they had made, it really came down to poor planning. George overlooked the significance that his wife was 8 years younger and what that meant to their joint retirement plan and the decisions he would have to make to protect his younger spouse. All of those decisions were overshadowed by the expectation of a substantial inheritance for George's wife in the future. And most of all, I think the biggest mistake was not having George's wife as the primary beneficiary on their retirement accounts, but also leaving her out of the planning. I have heard so many people tell their spouse, don't worry, everything's taken care of. Guess what? It rarely is. In my opinion, when both spouses are on board, your chances of happiness and success are much, much higher. Hey, that's it for this week's episode. I hope the story today was helpful for a lot of the listeners out there. And again, I want to remind listeners, check out our website, which is retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. There you can download my retirement secret sauce as well as our 2020 tax planning guide. So check out our website, retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. We will catch you next time for the next episode of the Retirement Made Easy podcast. Until then, remember, always dream big. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, please consult your attorney, financial advisor, or tax advisor prior to investing. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor, member of FINRA, SIPC.